If it bleeds, we can kill it.
In this build series, I'm going to be covering 3 different props I've created, and I'll be talking about them in the order that I made them, not in the order that they appeared in the movies. The first one is the Predator Shuriken, that was first shown in the Alien vs Predator film. The second one is the Biomask, which are based on features from both the first and second films. And the third one is the Gauntlet Blades, which is my own creative version based on all 3 of the films. The first Predator film could have been a lot different and could easily have been relegated to a B-grade film that nobody even remembers. The original concept and suit for the Predator was heavily delayed and certainly didn't match what the producer wanted for the production of the film. And the person that could have been the Predator, running around in that suit, well, that was Jean-Claude Van Damme. Once they decided that they weren't going with that version, production on the film was halted, and under the suggestion of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Stan Winston and his crew of creative people took over the production of the Predator. It was very much an under-the-gun project for them, but they were able to deliver what has become a truly classic creature effect in a little over 6 weeks from when they took on the project. And with help from the 7-foot 2-inch Kevin Peter Hall, they were able to create something that's definitely gone on to be one of film's most iconic movie monsters. The Shuriken was the first attempt I made at any of the Predator weapons. I did initially want to actually do the mask first, but at the time I was limited to the amount of metal that I could melt down at any one point. I did consider doing the energy disc from Predator 2, but I must admit I did like the look of the Shuriken a bit better. I started out by using a resin casting. As is quite often the case, there was a lot of flaws in the casting that needed to be repaired, even down to the curve of the blades, which weren't entirely correct and had to be adjusted as well. The biggest difference with this one, as opposed to a lot of the other casting that I'd previously done, is the blades themselves were quite thin and I was worried about how strong they would be. After a bit of testing though, I was pretty happy with the strength of them, and they were certainly a lot stronger than the resin version anyway. Because of how thin they were though, and the surface details that were on them, each of the blade pieces had to be pretty much all entirely finished by hand. And apart from the final polishing process, which was done on the machine, it really just meant spending heaps of time filing and sanding again until they were 100% right. The body of the piece was made in 2 clamshell halves, and each point of connection for the blades had its own little cupped out section, with the blades being held in place internally with a stainless steel pin. When the 2 clamshell pieces were brought together, they were then tapped and bolted together from opposite sides, with a countersunk screw head bolt, and then the head of those bolts were covered up with the hammer finished copper pieces that you see there. I started working on a display case for it around about the same time that I started working on the Biomask. When I started working on the mask, I was very limited for time because I was trying to get stuff ready for a display that I was going to be doing in Sydney. So rather than sculpting one from scratch, I was able to find a guy on eBay who was selling one. The nature of the sand casting has taught me that it's far easier to work out fine details after the fact rather than trying to deal with complicated overhangs that are just going to get hooked up in the moulding process. So I'm removing the laser sight section out of the mask, and I'll cast up that little detail piece individually in pewter so that I can add that as a finishing detail further in the project. I'm just using a 2-part epoxy putty to fill the hole that's created, and that'll give me a surface that's far less complicated to deal with when it comes to the sand casting. Because I wanted to make the mask up in one entire piece, I had a couple of problems that I had to deal with. I needed to be able to have the walls of the pattern piece thick enough to allow for the flow of the molten metal, but not so thick that the piece would end up being ridiculously heavy or exceed the amount of metal that I could melt down in my furnace. The mask as I received it was basically like a fiberglass shell type construction, and while the outer surface of it was very clean and well finished, it was pretty clear that the overall thickness of it would be way too thin for what I needed to do as far as the casting. I started out by mixing up some plain old plaster of Paris and just mixed it into a fairly thick clay-like consistency so that I could sculpt it on the inside surface of the mask to build up the thickness that I was going for. And the overall thickness that I was going for was around about 2 centimeters thick. Once I had that plaster put in place, I let it dry for a little bit, and then I started carving back the roughness of it just to make sure that the surface was relatively consistent, and then I finished that off even more by putting a thin skim coat over the top of it and then smoothing that out even further. And then finally, when the plaster was fully set, I sanded back the entire surface of the inside of the mask so that it more closely matched the surface of the outside. Now that I had a working piece that I could use as the pattern for the mould, because of the complexity of the shape of it, I had to work out how I was going to be able to get it out of the mould. To do that, I had to cut it up into several different pieces, and those pieces were cut in such a way that they would key back together and not slide around in the sand as I was packing it down to create the mould. I had to custom build a box that was big enough to accommodate the size of the mask, and because of the amount of sand and the moisture content that it has in it, the mould that I ended up creating weighed about 60 kilos. The mould needed to be produced in 3 different stages. The first stage was to key the pieces back together and then pack them loosely in around the sand. This was so the pieces could be held and keyed into place so that I could pack the sand down on the outer face part of the mask, I also used tape across the face of the mask to assist in holding the pieces in place. I then removed that tape to do the second stage of the moulding, which is what ends up being the first half of the finished mould. Once that was done, I was able to put the top half of the box on and then start packing that sand down to create that mould piece that I'm talking about. The whole thing here now you can see has been flipped upside down, with the mask now face down. This now means that I can put that box back on, start to repack the sand, and that gives me the finished mould. The pattern piece can then be removed and I'm ready to pour in the molten metal. By this stage I'd upgraded the crucible for my furnace. In terms of volume of metal, this was the largest single piece that I've yet to create, and thankfully I had just enough material to do a successful pour on the first attempt. And then from there the cleanup process could begin. I had to think a bit about the finish that I wanted to apply to this particular piece, because whilst it's significantly heavier than the fiberglass version they used in both films, I still wanted to create something that looked like it was wearable. The actor wore two different types of masks during filming, the biomask version, which is the one I'm obviously working on, and then a fully radio controlled version for the final reveal of the Predator's real face. For anybody that knows the second film, you'll know that there's more than one Predator that appears towards the end of the film. What you might not know is some of the guys that are in those Predator suits are actually members of the LA Lakers. Danny Glover was a big fan of the team at the time and called up some of the guys to take part because they needed some really big guys to fill some of those suits. One of the other interesting things about Predator 2 was in the scene where the Predator gets his arm chopped off. That was yet another practical effect that they were able to achieve with the help of a one-armed stuntman, R. David Smith. And in that scene, with the help of a wire rig, he really does fall from a 13-story building. Once I had the general surface rough cleaned back to the finish I was going for, I started moving on to what I needed to do as far as the removal of the excess metal around the eyes. I started out by following the general contour of the eye with a drill, and then just used a regular chisel to chisel those excess pieces out. And then the rest of the cleanup from around the eyes was mostly just done with hand files. I then started working on the smaller details, and I was able to use my renovator tool to cut in a lot of the lost line detail. I didn't want to go for a surface that was particularly highly polished on the mask, and I kind of like the idea of the surface of the metal kind of mimicking what the skin of the Predator would look like. So I'm using a contrasting technique of hammer finishing the metal and wire brush finishing the metal, and I used a ball peen hammer to get the finish that I was going for. It's very difficult to polish that type of finish, so the real trick to doing it is to not try and polish the surface so much, but instead to make sure that you're working with a polished hammer. And if you periodically make sure that that hammer is kept polished, that polished effect will transfer really nicely into the surface of the metal that you're working on. From there I just buffed down the surface with a light polish, then I cleaned off the polish residue with methylated spirits, and that leaves the metal ready for the patina and weathering finishes that I'm going to be applying later. I'm using a hexagonal type of mesh to start to create the effect for the eyes. Once I'd cut out a basic shape for it, I used a ball peen hammer to push it into the cavity area of the eyes so that it had a bit more of a curved shape when you could see it from the other side. From there I used a similar technique by cutting out a piece of aluminium plate, and once I had that hammered into place to match those similar sort of contours, I then marked it out from the reverse side so that I could cut away that middle section, so that I had a piece that would act as an outer frame that would hold that mesh piece in place, along with a piece of opaque white plastic which will act as a diffuser once I backlight the eye section. I made up the little laser targeting piece in pewter to get some extra details, and I've just lightly weathered it with some matte black paint. These are the three little laser diodes that I'm going to be using to mount inside it. I just got these ones off eBay, and at the time I think I picked up a packet of 10 of them for about $3 or $4, which is obviously quite cheap. There wasn't even any postage associated with these, and they sort of came out of Hong Kong after about a week or so. I drilled out and countersunk the holes so that they sit quite flush in there, and then I just used some Loctite glue to hold them in place so that they wouldn't fall out. There wasn't a great deal of messing around as far as the positioning of them concerned. Because I'm going to be building a display stand for this, I'm going to be wiring it into a 9-volt power supply. So I just needed to separate the wires into a negative and positive sort of bundle. But because they're running off a 9-volt supply, to ensure that there's not going to be any burnout issues with them, because the little diodes themselves are only a 3-volt setup, I'm going to be adding in a inline resistor on the positive side. They're just that little rice grain resistor sort of piece. There's got coating on the back there for people that know more about it than I do. So all I need to do is connect one of these to the positive side wire before I connect it to the 9-volt power supply. And I'll need to do that for each of the 3 diodes before it's all connected up. And rather than having a battery pack that's hidden inside the mask, The display stand that I'm going to create for it will have the necessary cables built into it, and the air hoses that normally go out the side of the biomask is what will hide the electrical cables that then connect to the base. I started building the base out of MDF board. I used 4 different layers to create a step-up sort of section for the bottom part of the base. And once I had those pieces sorted out, I then started carving away at them to create the effect of kind of like a step pyramid sort of effect. I initially marked them out with textures, and then I used a combination of my grinder and the renovator tool to start carving in the detail. And then I used a chisel to dig out the corners even deeper, and then went back over it again with the renovator tool to create some fine line crack details within the rock. To break up the flat smooth surface of the MDF, I then went over the entire thing with a wire brush, which created a nice uneven sort of sandstone effect over the surface of the timber. There's no underlying facial mask with this sort of setup, it's purely just something I'm making as a display stand to hold the biomask itself, but I will be adding in some extra bits to give it that sort of dreadlock effect once the mask is being held in place. Once I had all the individual pieces sorted out, they were just glued together, and this gave me a really nice hefty display stand. Because the mask itself is quite weighty, I didn't want it to be in a situation where it's top heavy and could topple over. I then trimmed off the excess down the side just to make sure the back section's all married up together, and then I started the painting and weathering of it to give it that sort of sandstone finish. Once I had that stone look sufficiently done, it was time to work out what I wanted to do as far as the dreadlocks. I used an EPDM sponge cord with a 12.5mm diameter. It's very, very durable. By using a fresh sanding disc, I was able to put a taper towards the end of it, and I found that that left it a little bit furry on the surface, so I used the flame to burn off that furriness. And whilst it was still alight, I used a piece of metal to roll it against the wood, which effectively repolished the surface back to an even consistency. I had a couple of large beads that were about the right size that I could use as decorations for the dreadlocks, and the larger metal pieces that you can see there are actually sterling silver ear cuffs. It's only a cheap barley silver, and by using 2 of them I could sandwich them together around the cord. It gave me a similar sort of look to what they were using in the film. When it came to mounting them on the base, the foam itself was firm enough that I was able to use some copper pipe clamps to pinch them down to the surface of the board, and there was no need to put a knot on it or anything to stop them from slipping out. Even though you never really see these pieces, I'm also just going to cover it up to make it a little bit tidier with the same type of foam that I used to create the neck area. The stuff that I used for that was pretty much similar to the yoga mats and stuff that you can get. The major reason why I chose that one over anything else is because it simply had the type of pattern that it had on the surface of the foam, and it matched in pretty well with the look that I was going for. The strip that you can see there is an RGB LED light strip, and that's the bit that's going to provide the backlighting for the eyes. And I've got that wired up in such a way that it can be switched over to either the red, green or the blue. Apart from that, I've also wired in a secondary cable connection that runs to the inside of the mask directly where the lasers connect to, and as I said, the wiring is hidden inside what would normally be the air hoses. I've drilled in a hole that runs right down through the centre of the stand, which goes out to where the power supply plugs in, which is the 9-volt power supply that I was talking about earlier. On the underside there you can see that there's an additional 2 wires that run up to a second location, and that's a hidden switching mechanism that I've created. I'm not sure that you can see it there, but that's kind of the point. So that front brick section there that's at the top of the pyramid allows me to trigger that switch, and the light comes on there where the eyes are going to be illuminated. And that also provides power to that secondary plug that I was talking about, which then provides power to the lasers. Because this one was being set up for public display, I was a little bit paranoid about the fact that somebody might go looking down the laser sights and burn their eyes with the lasers. So I made up 2 different sets, one which was a laser set, and the other one was a set that just had regular red LEDs in there so that there wasn't any chance of anybody injuring themselves. And having the 2 separate pieces like that allows me to switch them out pretty easily with that plug arrangement that I've come up with. But now that I've got the basic elements worked out for how I want to display it, I can move on to the final patina and finish of the mask itself. The technique that I'm using here is very similar to what I used on the Shuriken, and it's really just a matter of building up consecutive layers of finish and colour until I'm happy with the overall look of it. And believe it or not, what I'm using to get the patina effect on the metal is actually a wood stain. There's a number of different colours that I use to create different colour effects on the metal, from a sort of coppery colour to a goldy colour. I've found by using the wood stains like this on the metal and then baking them on either with a flame or a hot air gun, they adhere to the surface really nicely, and then I use light spray layers of clear lacquer to permanently lock the colours to the surface of the metal. You can see here that I'm going over it with a hot air gun to bake down one of those layers. Then I'll rub that back a little bit, lock it into place, and then go over it with another colour until I get the desired look that I'm going for. Once I'm happy with the final finish of it, I'm going over it with a Scotch-Brite pad to allow some of that metal silver to come back through, and then the entire surface is sprayed down with a clear coat of lacquer to lock everything into place. The Gauntlet Blades that I'm making conceptually are sort of taken from the first and second films as well, and with a little bit of the computer game thrown in there too. I was able to find a version of the blades that I like the look of online. As I said, these are pretty much taken from the computer game, and they're quite a bit longer than the ones that are featured in the first and second films. I transferred the template I found onto a piece of MDF that was about the right thickness, and once I cut out that rough shape, I started carving away at it to get the contour details I was after. Once I had those shapes roughed out, I obviously had to transfer it to the other side, and I wanted to make sure I got it as close to identical as I possibly could. So I used a piece of tracing paper to do a rubbing of the side that I'd already done, so that I could get a perfect match on both sides. Once I'd carved out the other side, I gave it an all-over light sanding down, and then I coated the entire surface with a 2-part resin so that the MDF was completely water sealed. Once that had set hard, I sanded it back one more time and then coated the entire surface with a high gloss primer. This gave me the pattern piece that I needed to melt down some metal and cast it in aluminium. The casting for these ones were done a little bit differently. This time round I'm using a vertical casting box, which is very similar to the way that they would have made bronze swords and spearheads back in the day. I used this type of technique because the blade is quite thin, and if I was to pour it out horizontally, there would be a pretty good chance that the metal would freeze into the mould before it had a chance to flow all the way through. This is another example of a press mould box, where the two halves of the mould are squashed together rather than the sand being packed over the top of the pattern piece. And then, just like all the other cast parts, it was a matter of sanding and cleaning it up to the point where it was ready for final finishing. For this project, unlike most where I've tried to get as close to movie accurate as possible, there's lots of different variations on the theme of the Gauntlet Blades, depending on which movie you're looking at, and right across the entire series, and even right back to the original, there's lots of differences in the configuration of how this thing can be put together. So the design that I'm going for is really an amalgamation of all the different features that I like most in each of them, and what I'm really after is to make up something that matches the style of the character rather than matching one particular film. The internal workings is based on how a switchblade works, in terms of you've got a small amount of movement in the lever which creates a large amount of movement in the actual blade. The difference is normally the blade operates on the inside mechanism, and I've had to modify my thinking of the design to actually get that to work on the outside. The idea being is that these blades are going to be mounted on the side there, and the operation of it will pull them forwards and backwards. And what we end up with is this. That builds up tension in the spring internally, and in the last centimetre of movement, it fires it forward. That is now put in a lock position for the return mechanism, and the idea now is that that backward motion again builds up tension in the spring, and once again that last centimetre fires it back, and that is repeatable each time. So if you can imagine the blades put either side there, you can imagine how that forward and backward movement will work. So internally, what we've got with this cradling piece is the spring release mechanism for the part that actually carries the blade. There's a leaf spring that goes across the top of that, so they return by themselves, but at the moment I've got it pulled apart so you can see how they work. Normally this sort of mechanism would be done internally, but because what I'm trying to do is get an external movement, I've put them on the outside to allow for the actual movement of the slider. The slider piece is the bit that will have the blades mounted onto it. You can see that that can move freely across that carriage unless the locking mechanisms are in place. Now the idea is that that latches into place, and the tension that's built up within the spring is what fires it down the track when that gate opens. What makes the whole thing work is the spring assembly that I've got here. The little arm coming out to the side there is the operation lever, and it both builds up the tension in the spring and releases the tension in the spring in that last centimetre of movement. So I'll pop that in place, and hopefully I can show you how it works. You can see the notch that we've got cut out here. That notch allows the gate section to fall into place. You'll have to imagine that that piece is sat in there like that. So as that travels, it's still held in place, and this slot allows for the tension to be built up in the spring. As the tension builds up in the spring, that last centimetre of travel pushes the gate out of the way and releases the tension on the spring. So the tension that we're talking about is that spring there, which is held in that position up until that last minute and then fires, catapulting the carriage down the track until it catches at the other end. And because this is a mirror image of each other, this is mirrored on the same side here, that gate closes as it passes by. So as it passes by, the spring pushes it out of the way and then it drops back into place again. And then the whole thing is repeated in the opposite direction. I'll see if I can do this without cutting my finger off. As that pushes in, you can see the tension building on the spring. This is where it's being held here. The gate is being held closed. As soon as it gets to that point where it releases, it catapults and throws halfway across my workshop. Now normally with the top cover in place that wouldn't happen. It would just slide to the end, be caught, and the whole process can be repeated again with that latch catch sort of mechanism. And that is basically how it works. And then the top cover, which holds all that in place, that has got enough thickness in this that I can sort of tap threads directly into this for when it comes to making up the final look of the gauntlet. I had a pretty large diameter piece of aluminium tube in amongst my scrap bin. I've used a little bit more than half of it to start out with, and I'm just trimming it down on the bandsaw so that I can match it up to the housing of the blades. I could have just left it on that angle, but I really want to build in some muscular contour into the shape of the metal, so I'm just starting out by reducing the curve in the metal so that it matches more closely from the arm to the wrist, and I'll have to do that several times during the course of the shaping of the metal to be able to start working in those contours that I'm going for. The technique that I'm using here is called cold forging for obvious reasons. I do have a gas blowtorch that I'm using there in the foreground, and you can see that I'm just heating up the metal a little bit from time to time just to make it a little bit more malleable. But unfortunately you can't do a lot of heating when it comes to aluminium if you become too aggressive with the heat. The metal's more inclined to split than stretch. So in this instance it's a little bit more about beating the metal into submission so you can start to develop that muscular sort of shape. This is pretty much the same sort of technique that you would use to make armour, except normally doing it in steel where you've heated up the metal, you can move the metal around a lot more quickly. One of the big advantages to cold forging the aluminium like this though is that it does actually add quite a bit of tensile strength to the metal. I've obviously sped this up and cut it down quite a bit just so you can get an idea of the process, but from start to finish it took me a little over 2 hours to get the exact shape that I was after. I don't have a rounding tool for my anvil, so I'm just using a coal chisel that's mounted in my vise. It's got a pretty rounded top on it that's been hammered down after years of use, and it's about the right shape I need for the final stage of shaping out the metal. And I think you can see the shape that I've beaten into the metal there in comparison to the plain untouched metal. The next bit I'm doing is pretty straightforward. I'm just bending over a couple of pieces of metal that will form the top cover. And once I've cut some slots into it to allow for the movement of the blades, that's pretty much all I need for a top housing before I start adding the decorative elements to the top and side of it. One thing I am doing that's just a little bit different is rather than just using off-the-shelf hosing for some of the elements on the side, I've decided to make up a custom piece. I'm just hammering it down on the anvil to make it a lot more consistent across the surface and finishing off the ends there. So that's the basic top and side profile worked out in terms of the housing for the blade. I've still got to make up the bit that encloses the side there, and that'll incorporate the mounting element of how the arm section is attached. Essentially what I'm doing is starting out by creating a bridge between the upper and lower halves, and I've got some old pizza trays that are just the right thickness of metal I need for it. And once I've got the metal hammered out the way I want, I'm just using temporary screws to work out where all the seam alignments are going to be. The trick with this is I need to make up an outer shell that gives me the look that I'm going for, without creating any internal obstructions for the blade mechanism. As much as possible I want to make all the joins and seams hidden, so I'm going to be using a process of overlapping layers to hide each join from the next. I've worked out by taking some of the square tube aluminium and squashing it down, I can make up a really nice dragon scale sort of effect that should give me a really nice transition between the top and bottom halves of the gauntlet. Once I'm happy that I've got all the alignment where I need it to be, I take out all the temporary screws and then replace them with rivets, and it's these riveted seam points that I mostly want to hide along the side and top edge of it. Before I start attaching all the individual components, I'm just cutting away the excess metal so that it has a better contour of how it sits on the muscle of the arm. And once all the permanent rivets are in place, I can go over the surface and hammer those joint areas down nice and flat, so that when I put the copper cover pieces over these seams, they sit nice and flush to the metal. Here I'm making up a template piece that I'm going to use when it comes to the inside lining. The inside lining is basically the very last piece that will be attached, once I'm happy that everything's in place and all the mechanisms are working properly. I'm going over the entire surface with a wire brush. It just helps to blend the overall consistency back to one type of finish, and it creates a really nice dimpling surface across the metal that'll help me out when it comes to the paint and weathering stage of the build. As a final stage of the cleanup, I'm adding almost like a wood grain element to the surface of the flatter parts of the metal, and to do that I'm just using an old paint scraper that's been sharpened on the edge to hammer in those details. Once I've got the final alignment worked out for the overlapping elements, I can start working out what parts need to be attached first so that each join is hidden by the next piece that's being attached. The copper's a much softer metal and it's a lot easier to manipulate, so once I've got it attached, I can fold those edges over pretty easily to get it to blend in. You can see there now how each scale piece hides the join that was done previously, and the last piece that's being attached to 3 rivets there will eventually be covered up as well. Just working out the shaping of the copper pieces that'll cover up the top side seams, and once they're attached that'll completely hide that riveted seam line. On the underside of the gauntlet I've done some overlapping type pieces as well. On these ones though I've left the rivets exposed because I think it ties in quite nicely with the look of it. Now that all the decorative elements are made up, time to start getting the paint and weathering done. I'm doing it up to match in with the projects that I've done previously. The only major difference is this time around I'm adding a little bit of blue to shine through on some of the layers. Once I've got a few layers of paint on the surface, you can see me using some maple wood stain to add a bit more of a bronze or copper sort of look to the surface of the metal as well. At this point the whole thing's been sprayed now with a gloss lacquer, and I'm starting to add in the individual copper components. I'm just using a black silicone to glue the copper components into place. And once they're clamped into place, I let them sit overnight to give the silicone enough time to fully cure. Then it's just a matter of reassembling all the parts and mechanisms. Like the Terminator, I hope one day to be able to do a full life-size sculpture of the Predator, and it'll be nice if I can incorporate these props into that build. Obviously that would be a huge undertaking. It's definitely one that's on my one-day list.